When I first moved to Oak Ridge Estates 5 years ago, I was drawn to the natural beauty of the hillside community. Tall pines framed stunning valley views, and the sloped lots created a terraced neighborhood effect that felt harmonious with the landscape. As an environmental engineer by profession, I appreciated good design that worked with nature rather than against it. My background in hydrology made me immediately notice the water management challenges on my property. During even moderate rainfall, water would cascade down the slope, carrying away topsoil and creating small channels that grew deeper with each storm. The previous owners had installed basic gutters that discharged directly onto the lawn, accelerating erosion problems. More concerning was how this runoff continued downhill toward my neighbors, potentially threatening their foundations over time. I decided to research sustainable solutions that would not only address my property issues but benefit the surrounding ecosystem. Rain gardens emerged as the perfect answer. These specialized landscape features are designed to collect runoff and allow it to slowly infiltrate the ground rather than racing downhill. They also create habitats for native plants and wildlife, while naturally filtering pollutants from the water. Creating a proper rain garden system is not simply digging a hole and planting flowers. I spent months studying topographical maps, calculating water volumes, and researching which native plants would thrive in periodically saturated soil while having root systems strong enough to hold hillsides in place. I contacted the city water management department and was connected with a specialist who enthusiastically approved of my plans. She helped me navigate the permitting process and even used my design as a case study for sustainable residential water management. The financial investment was substantial. Between engineering consultations, permits, specialized soil mixtures, hardscaping materials, and rare native plants, I put nearly $20,000 into the project. The physical labor was equally demanding. I spent every weekend for a year digging, hauling stones, building retaining features, and carefully positioning plants according to their water tolerance and root structures. By the third spring, my vision had become reality. The garden stepped down the hillside in a series of beautiful, functional pools connected by rock-lined channels. During rainfall, water collected in the uppermost basin, filled with deep-rooted prairie plants, then gradually filtered down through increasingly moisture-loving species. By the time water reached the bottom of my property, most had already percolated into the ground, replenishing the water table rather than eroding the hillside. Neighbors often stopped to admire the colorful native flowers and abundant butterflies. My next-door neighbor, Alina, would bring her grandchildren over to watch tadpoles in the small retention pond at the garden center. "It is like a little slice of paradise," she told me once. "So much more interesting than everyone else's boring lawns." Few realize that beneath the beauty lay a sophisticated engineering system protecting all our properties. Everything changed when the Homeowners Association held its annual election. The previous board had been reasonable, focusing mainly on maintaining common areas and organizing community events. The new members, however, were led by a woman named Victoria Harrington, who had moved from an exclusive gated community and immediately began talking about increasing property values and aesthetic consistency. During their introduction at the community center, I noticed how they surveyed the room not with neighborly warmth but with calculating assessment, as though mentally flagging violations. Their arrival felt like a pressure change before a storm, subtle but unmistakable. The first letter arrived on a Tuesday, the official HOA envelope instantly recognizable in my mailbox. I opened it expecting a community newsletter or notice about upcoming events. Instead, I found a formal complaint regarding unapproved landscape modifications that violate neighborhood aesthetic guidelines. The letter demanded I submit retroactive landscaping approval forms or face potential fines. This made no sense. My garden had been established for nearly 2 years at this point, and I had obtained all necessary permits from both the city and the previous HOA board. I immediately called the number listed at the bottom of the letter and reached Victoria Harrington, the new HOA president. Mrs. Harrington, I received this notice about my garden, but there must be some confusion, I explained calmly. I have all the necessary approvals from both the city and the previous HOA board. The garden is fully compliant with water management regulations. The previous board was negligent in enforcing standards, she responded coolly. You're so called garden does not conform to the aesthetic guidelines outlined in the community bylaws. Section 8.3 clearly states that front landscaping must maintain a cohesive appearance with neighboring properties. Your wild plant collection looks unkempt and reduces curb appeal for the entire street. I took a deep breath. With respect, Mrs. Harrington, this is not just a decorative garden. It is an engineered rain garden system designed to manage stormwater runoff on our hillside. The plants may look natural, but each serves a specific purpose. I have documentation from the City Water Management Department explaining its environmental importance. Environmental concerns do not supersede HOA regulations, she replied dismissively. Please submit the proper forms for review, though I will tell you now the board is unlikely to approve such an unconventional design. We are trying to create uniformity in Oak Ridge Estates. Over the next few weeks, I gathered all my documentation. The city permits, the original HOA approval, the environmental impact assessments, and hydrology reports that showed how my garden prevented thousands of gallons of water from rushing downhill during heavy rains. I also spoke with neighbors, explaining the situation and asking for their support. Many were horrified at the threat to my garden. Alina immediately offered to circulate a petition. That garden is not just beautiful, it is functional, she insisted. And those new board members need to understand they cannot just come in and change rules on a whim. The retired geology professor 3 doors down, Dr. Whitaker, was particularly concerned. Hillside water management is not something to take lightly, he warned. Natural water channels, once disrupted, will find new paths, often destructive ones. Armed with expert support and thorough documentation, I attended the monthly HOA meeting held in the community center. The fluorescent lighting cast harsh shadows as I approached the table where 5 board members sat in a row, Victoria centered among them like a judge presiding over court. I carefully laid out my documents and began my presentation. As you can see from these city-approved plans, the rain garden serves a critical infrastructure purpose, I explained, pointing to the detailed diagrams. These retention basins slow water during heavy rainfall, preventing erosion not just on my property but for everyone downhill. I was halfway through my explanation when Victoria raised her hand, cutting me off. We understand you are enthusiastic about your hobby garden, she said with a condescending smile. However, the board has already discussed this matter privately. While your environmental interests are commendable, they do not align with the premium neighborhood aesthetic we are developing. One of the other board members, a man who I later learned was a real estate developer, barely looked up from his phone as he added, potential buyers expect manicured lawns and traditional landscaping. Your experimental garden, regardless of its supposed purpose, detracts from that expectation. Supposed purpose, I repeated, feeling heat rise in my face. This is not supposed, it is documented science. Water management on hillsides is critical infrastructure. Victoria simply waved her hand dismissively. The decision has been made. You have 30 days to restore your front yard to compliant landscaping, or the HOA will take measures to enforce compliance, including fines and potential liens. 3 days later, a certified letter arrived containing a final notice. It outlined specific penalties that would begin accumulating in 30 days and included threatening language about the HOA's right to remedy violations at the homeowner's expense. Standing in my garden as evening approached, I read the letter twice, then looked up at the horizon where dark storm clouds had begun gathering. The metaphor was not lost on me. A storm was indeed coming. The day everything changed began normally. I left for work at my usual time, planning to stop at the hardware store on my way home to buy supplies for temporary erosion barriers around my garden. The HOA deadline was still 2 weeks away, and I had been consulting with an environmental attorney about my options. Though the situation was stressful, I still believed reason would prevail. I pulled into my driveway at 5:47 p.m., my mind on the grocery list for dinner. The sound registered before the sight did. The mechanical growl of heavy equipment, completely out of place on our quiet street. As I turned the corner of my house toward the backyard, the scene that greeted me was straight from a nightmare. An excavator stood in the middle of what had been my rain garden, its yellow arm extended, bucket tearing through carefully placed stone barriers. Two workers in orange vests were pulling native plants from the soil and tossing them into a debris trailer. Mud and uprooted vegetation why everywhere. The careful terracing, built over months of backbreaking labor, had been reduced to chaotic piles of earth. My body reacted before my mind could process what was happening. I ran toward the excavator, waving my arms frantically. "Stop! Stop right now! What are you doing?" I shouted, my voice cracking with panic and disbelief. The operator noticed me and paused, engine still rumbling. From behind the excavator stepped Victoria Harrington, clipboard in hand, wearing immaculate beige pants and a button-down shirt completely unsuited for a construction site. She looked completely unmoved by my distress. "Mrs. Harrington, what is happening here?" I demanded, struggling to keep my voice steady. "You cannot do this. The deadline has not even passed." She consulted her clipboard as if double-checking some minor detail. Section 12.4 of the HOA bylaws grants the board authority to remedy persistent violations after formal notice has been given. Your notice was delivered 17 days ago. The notice gave me 30 days. My hands were shaking now, partly from shock, partly from rage. "This is illegal. You have no right to be on my property." The board voted for expedited action given the extensive nature of the violations, she replied coolly. "We need to complete the restoration before the weekend's open houses. 3 properties on this street are currently listed, and your non-compliant landscaping is affecting their marketability." I could not believe what I was hearing. "You are destroying critical water management infrastructure because of open houses. Do you have any idea what you have done?" I gestured to the destruction around us. "This garden prevents flooding. It stabilizes the entire hillside." Victoria sighed as if dealing with a difficult child. "Our landscaping contractor will install standard sod and appropriate ornamental shrubs tomorrow. The HOA will place a special assessment on your account for the costs." By now, neighbors had begun to notice the commotion. Elena emerged from her house, followed by the couple who lived on the other side. More residents appeared further down the street, drawn by the unusual noise and my raised voice. "This is outrageous," Elena said, marching up to Victoria. "You cannot just bulldoze someone's property without proper notice." Victoria turned to face the growing crowd. The HOA is acting within its legal authority to maintain community standards. I would ask that uninvolved residents return to their homes. This is a matter between the board and the homeowner in violation. I pulled out my phone and began documenting the destruction, taking video of the workers continuing to dismantle my carefully engineered system. I have permits from the city for this garden. It is a designated water management system. What you are doing is not just against HOA rules, it is against city environmental codes. Victoria appeared unmoved by this information. She nodded to the excavator operator, who resumed ripping through the remaining intact sections of my garden. The sound of roots tearing from soil felt physical, like something breaking inside my chest. For nearly an hour I stood watching, documenting everything as tears streamed down my face. Neighbors came and went, some staying to offer support, others just gawking at the spectacle. Dr. Whitaker, the geology professor, arrived and immediately grasped the severity of the situation. "This is environmental vandalism," he stated loudly enough for everyone to hear. "When the rains come, that hillside has nothing to slow the water now." As if on cue, phones throughout the neighborhood began chiming with alerts. The National Weather Service was issuing a severe weather warning for our county. Unprecedented rainfall was expected over the next 3 days, with potential for flash flooding in hillside areas. By the time the excavator and workers finally left, the garden was unrecognizable. Where there had once been a thoughtfully designed series of basins and channels lined with deep-rooted native plants, there was now just exposed dirt, random piles of mud, and torn vegetation. 3 years of work and $20,000 of investment had been destroyed in an afternoon. I knelt in the mud, gathering what plants I could salvage, placing them in buckets of water in a desperate attempt to keep them alive. The dark clouds on the horizon seemed to mirror the dread building inside me. Without the rain garden's protection, what would happen to our hillside when the storms arrived? The rain began shortly after midnight. I lay awake in bed, listening to the first gentle patter on the roof gradually intensify into a steady drumming. Lightning flashed through my bedroom window, momentarily illuminating the collection of salvaged plants in buckets lining my hallway. Each flash was followed by the low rumble of thunder drawing closer. In previous storms, I would find comfort in knowing my garden was owing its job, collecting and managing the water that would otherwise cause damage. Now that protection was gone, leaving nothing but exposed soil vulnerable to the elements. Every rainfall sound felt like a threat. Sleep was impossible. I kept picturing water carving new channels through my yard, carrying away topsoil, finding new destructive paths downhill toward my neighbors' homes. Around 2 in the morning, I put on a raincoat and boots and ventured outside with a flashlight to survey what was happening. The scene confirmed my worst fears. Without the tiered basins and vegetation to slow its progress, water was already forming rivulets across my backyard, merging into larger streams at the property line before continuing downhill. The specially engineered soil that had once absorbed water like a sponge had been scraped away, leaving compacted dirt that repelled water rather than absorbing it. I did what I could with the limited materials on hand, placing scrap lumber and rocks to divert the most aggressive water flows away from direct paths to my neighbors' properties. It was like putting Band-Aids on a broken dam. By the time I returned inside, soaked and muddy, my efforts seemed pathetically inadequate against the force of nature that had been unleashed. At 6:18 a.m., my phone chimed with an incoming text. It was from a leaner. "Water coming into basement. Never happened before. Others reporting same. Something wrong with hillside." Before I could respond, another message appeared from a neighbor 2 doors down whom I barely knew. Flooding in lower level. Water pressure building against foundation wall. Is this happening to everyone? Over the next hour, my phone lit up with increasingly panicked messages from downhill neighbors. I dressed quickly and went outside again, this time in full daylight, though the heavy cloud cover and continuing rain made it seem like perpetual twilight. What I saw made my stomach sink. From my vantage point near the top of the hill, I could see how water was behaving across the neighborhood. Without my rain garden's retention system, the water that would normally be captured and slowly released was now flowing unchecked down the hillside in concentrated streams. These channels were visibly growing deeper, cutting through yards, pooling against home foundations, and finding every weakness in the neighborhood's infrastructure. I made my way down the street, the water in some areas already ankle-deep. Neighbors were outside despite the downpour, attempting to protect their homes with hastily acquired sandbags and makeshift barriers. The Martinez family had formed a bucket brigade, desperately trying to bail out their garage, where a newly formed stream was pouring in through the side door. "This has never happened before," Mr. Martinez told me, his voice strained from exertion. "We have lived here 12 years through many storms, never water like this." I helped them position garbage cans to divert the flow away from their garage, knowing it was merely redirecting the problem elsewhere. The guilt was overwhelming. While I had not destroyed my rain garden, I knew exactly what its absence meant for everyone downhill from me. By mid-afternoon, the situation had deteriorated significantly. 3 homes at the bottom of the hill had reported partial foundation wall collapses. Emergency services were stretched thin across the county, responding to numerous flood-related calls. Several families had evacuated to higher ground, taking only essential belongings. The HOA emergency meeting was hastily arranged for 4:00 p.m. at the local church, one of the few buildings in the area with a generator and situated on higher ground. As I entered the main hall, the tension was palpable. Residents sat in wooden pews, many still in rain gear, some visibly distressed. Water dripped from the ceiling in one corner where the old roof had begun to leak. Victoria and the other board members sat at a table at the front, looking significantly less composed than during our previous encounter. Victoria's perfectly styled hair now hung limply around her face, and her expression conveyed growing alarm as homeowners described damage to their properties. Midway through the meeting, the city's emergency management coordinator arrived with a geological engineer. They spread out maps on a table and began explaining the severity of the situation in technical terms that caused the room to fall silent. "The hillside's natural water diversion system has been compromised," the engineer explained, pointing to areas on the topographical map. "Water is now creating new channels, causing accelerated erosion and soil destabilization. What would normally take decades of gradual water action is happening in days due to the concentrated water flow." The emergency coordinator looked up from the maps directly at Victoria. "We understand from multiple residents that an engineered rain garden system at the upper Tian of the hillside was recently removed. Is that correct?" All eyes turned toward the HOA board. Victoria shifted uncomfortably before answering. "The HOA authorized removal of non-compliant landscaping from one property. Yes, it was a standard enforcement of community guidelines." "That non-compliant landscaping," the engineer said, his voice carrying clear authority, "appears to have been functioning as critical water management infrastructure. Without it, hydrostatic pressure is building behind several foundations. we are seeing early signs of potential slippage in the soil composition. As if to punctuate his assessment, a loud crack echoed from outside. Through the windows, we could see a retaining wall at the edge of the church parking lot beginning to buckle under the pressure of saturated soil behind it. The reality of what was happening could no longer be denied by anyone in the room. "We need immediate emergency measures," the coordinator announced. "Some homes may need to be evacuated until structural engineers can assess foundation damage. The city is bringing in pumps and temporary barriers, but with the forecast showing another 48 hours of rain, we are facing a serious situation." I sat silently through these announcements, a mixture of vindication and heartbreak washing over me. Everything I had warned about was coming to pass, exactly as I had feared. The garden had not just been my personal project. It had been invisible infrastructure protecting everyone, and now it was gone. The full extent of the damage became apparent only after the rain finally stopped 3 days later. Morning sunlight revealed a neighborhood transformed by muddy devastation. What had once been manicured lawns were now torn through with deep erosion channels. Driveways had buckled where underlying soil had washed away. Uprooted shrubs and landscaping materials lay scattered across lower properties, carried there by the uncontrolled water flow. City officials and insurance adjusters moved methodically through the neighborhood, clipboards in hand, documenting the destruction. I walked behind them at a distance, my own property relatively unscathed due to its position near the top of the hill. The same could not be said for those below me. The Anderson family, who lived 3 houses downhill, had returned to find their finished basement completely flooded, family photos and heirlooms destroyed by contaminated water. Insurance adjusters delivered the crushing news I had been dreading. "Unfortunately, your policy specifically excludes damage resulting from modified water management systems," the adjuster explained to Mr. Anderson as I passed by. "The report indicates the HOA deliberately removed established water mitigation infrastructure, which constitutes a man-made, preventable incident rather than a natural disaster." Similar conversations were happening throughout the neighborhood. Insurance companies were denying claims left and right, citing the deliberate removal of my rain garden as the proximate cause of damage. This was not an act of God, in insurance terminology. It was a human-caused disaster with clear responsibility. The neighborhood's mood shifted palpably. Where there had been confused despair now grew focused anger. Residents who had previously paid little attention to HOA politics were now demanding answers from the board members. Victoria and her allies were nowhere to be seen during these confrontations, sending automated emails about assessing the situation and consulting with experts. 4 families on the steepest section of the hillside received the worst news. City inspectors placed bright red tags on their front doors declaring the structures unsafe for habitation until major foundation repairs could be completed. The Martinez family, whose garage I had helped protect during the initial flooding, stood in their driveway watching a moving truck being loaded with whatever possessions they could salvage. "Where will you go?" I asked Mrs. Martinez, who held her youngest child on her hip, the girl clutching a stuffed unicorn with a death grip. "My sister has room for us in Portland. The inspector says it could be 6 months before the house is safe again." She looked at me with eyes rimmed red from crying and lack of sleep. "We did everything right. We paid our insurance. We followed all the rules. How could they let this happen?" I had no answer that would bring her comfort. The guilt I felt was overwhelming, even though rationally I knew this was not my fault. My garden had been protecting them. I had tried to warn everyone of the consequences. Local news vans began appearing by the second day after the rain. Reporters stood on street corners, gesturing to visible cracks in foundations and collapsed retaining walls. Neighbors who had never spoken to journalists in their lives now gave angry interviews, pointing up the hill toward where my garden had once stood. The HOA destroyed the one thing keeping us safe, Dr. Whitaker explained to a reporter from the regional news station. Anyone with basic knowledge of hillside hydrology could have predicted these consequences. It was environmental vandalism with predictable results. State environmental protection officials arrived midweek marking areas with bright flags and taking photographs of rare plant species that had been destroyed. My rain garden had included several protected wetland plants, specifically chosen for their water management properties. The officials took particular interest in documented evidence of the garden's destruction, requesting copies of my videos and the HOA's written removal orders. The unauthorized destruction of protected wetland species is a separate violation, one official explained as she collected soil samples from my yard. These plants were serving a critical environmental function. Their removal without proper permits triggers additional regulatory consequences. Victoria finally emerged from seclusion to hold an improper press conference at the community center. Flanked by the HOA's attorney, she read a prepared statement expressing deep concern for affected homeowners, while carefully avoiding any admission of responsibility. The unprecedented rainfall would have caused significant damage regardless of landscaping conditions, she claimed, sweat beading on her forehead despite the cool temperature. The HOA board acted within its authority to maintain community standards. No one could have anticipated these unusual weather circumstances. The assembled homeowners responded with open hostility, shouting questions and accusations that Victoria refused to address. As cameras flashed capturing her increasingly flustered expression, supporters who had once backed her property value platform began physically distancing themselves, moving away as if her failure might be contagious. The journalist who had interviewed Dr. Whitaker approached Victoria with a devastating follow-up question. We have obtained copies of emails in which you were specifically warned about the flood prevention function of the rain garden you ordered destroyed. Would you care to comment on those warnings? Victoria's face went pale. The HOA attorney immediately ended the press conference, ushering her away through a side door as more questions were shouted after them. By the end of the week, the situation had evolved from a neighborhood disaster to a regional news story. HOA destroys flood protection, neighborhood pays price, ran as the headline in the county newspaper. Environmental groups issued statements condemning the reckless destruction of green infrastructure. Local politicians, sensing an opportunity to appear environmentally conscious, called for investigations into HOA regulatory oversight. Through it all, families continued to suffer real consequences. Children were enrolled in distant schools while their homes underwent repairs. Elderly residents struggled to find temporary accommodations that could meet their needs. The financial burden grew as homeowners realized they would need to fight their insurance companies for coverage. The community that had once been divided by petty HOA regulations was now united by a common experience of loss and a shared target for their anger. Every denied insurance claim, every moving truck, every construction estimate strengthened their resolve to hold those responsible accountable. What had begun as one garden's destruction had triggered a cascade of consequences that no one, not even I, had fully anticipated. My living room had never been designed to hold 20 people, but necessity had transformed it into our command center. Maps of the neighborhood covered my dining table, color-coded to show damage severity. Legal notepads filled with names, contact information, and detailed accounts of losses were stacked on every surface. Laptops displayed environmental statutes and insurance regulations as neighbors crowded around, taking notes and sharing information. "The key is documenting everything," explained Marcus Chen, an affected homeowner who fortunately worked as a paralegal at an environmental law firm. "Every communication with the HOA, every repair estimate, every conversation with insurance adjusters. We need to establish a clear timeline of negligence." What had begun as spontaneous gatherings of frustrated neighbors had evolved into an organized coalition with a singular purpose: holding the HOA board accountable and securing compensation for damages. We had given ourselves a simple name: the Hillside Alliance. 3 environmental attorneys had agreed to consult with us pro bono after learning about our situation. Their assessment was encouraging. The documented warnings that were ignored, combined with the HOA's failure to consult experts before removing established water management infrastructure, creates a strong liability case. The lead attorney explained during our third meeting. We developed a systematic approach to gathering evidence. Residents shared email exchanges with the HOA board, particularly any that mentioned my rain garden or water management concerns. Dr. Whitaker compiled a comprehensive report on hillside hydrology and the specific role the destroyed garden had played in protecting downslope properties. I provided all my original documentation, including permits, design plans, and the formal warnings I had submitted about potential consequences. While the legal strategy developed, we also focused on immediate community needs. The church basement became a donation center where affected families could find essential supplies. Those with habitable homes offered spare rooms to displaced neighbors. A local restaurant provided free meals 3 times a week for anyone involved in cleanup or repairs. A leaner, whose organizational skills proved invaluable, coordinated a fundraiser at the community center. "Some families have lost everything," she reminded volunteers as they set up auction items donated by local businesses. "Insurance may eventually pay, but people need help now." The fundraiser exceeded all expectations. Beyond our neighborhood, people from across the city came to show support after seeing news coverage of our plight. By evening's end, we had raised enough to provide emergency funds for the most severely impacted families and establish a legal fund for the battles ahead. Perhaps most valuable were the expert testimonies we gathered about my former rain garden's critical function. A hydrologist from the state university conducted computer modeling that demonstrated how the garden had been absorbing and redirecting an estimated 60,000 gallons of water during major rain events. A botanist documented how the specific plant species had created a living filtration system with root structures ideally suited for soil retention. This was not merely decorative landscaping, the hydrologist testified in a recorded deposition. This was functional green infrastructure designed to precise specifications for this exact hillside gradient. Its removal directly contributed to the subsequent water damage pattern we observed. With our case building strength, we presented our findings to the city council at their monthly meeting. I found myself at the podium, surrounded by neighbors, facing local government officials who listened with increasing concern as we outlined what had happened. "We are not just seeking compensation," I explained, my voice steadier than I expected. "We are asking for emergency intervention to prevent further damage and for regulatory changes that would protect environmental infrastructure from HOA overreach." The council chambers were filled to capacity with affected homeowners. When asked how many had experienced damage, nearly every hand in the room went up. The visual impact was undeniable. Meanwhile, the HOA board members were facing their own reckoning. We learned through a sympathetic administrative assistant that they had been meeting almost daily with attorneys, reviewing documents that highlighted their potential personal liability. Victoria had reportedly tried to claim that she had been acting on legal advice, which her fellow board members quickly disputed, creating fractures in their once unified front. From our vantage point, we could see their increasingly desperate attempts at damage control. They hired a public relations consultant who suggested community listening sessions that no one attended. They proposed a special assessment to fund repairs, which was universally rejected by homeowners who correctly identified this as an attempt to make victims pay for the board's mistakes. Most tellingly, yard signs began appearing throughout the neighborhood. Accountability now accompanied by a simple graphic of a rain garden. The message was clear. The community that the HOA had claimed to protect had united against them, demanding justice for what had been lost. As we gathered for what would be our final strategy session, before legal proceedings began in earnest, there was a sense of purpose that transcended individual grievances. We had been transformed from isolated homeowners into a cohesive force with shared objectives. The disaster had revealed what the neighborhood could be when working together rather than against each other over trivial violations and aesthetic disagreements. The legal proceedings lasted nearly 6 months, but the outcome exceeded even our most optimistic projections. The judge hearing our class action lawsuit against the HOA and individual board members showed particular interest in the environmental aspects of the case. When the settlement terms were finally read in court, sunlight streamed through the high windows, symbolically appropriate for what felt like the first rays of justice after a long storm. The HOA's insurance policy would pay maximum damages, supplemented by a smaller but significant contribution from the personal liability insurance of each board member. Victoria and 2 other board members who had been most directly involved in the decision to destroy my garden would be required to resign immediately. Most importantly, the settlement mandated full restoration of the rain garden system, expanded to include additional properties for more comprehensive hillside protection. When the judge asked if I had any statement for the court, I kept it brief. This case was never about assigning blame, I said, looking directly at the former HOA board members. It was about recognizing that environmental systems are not mere decorations. They provide essential services that protect all of us. I hope the restoration project becomes a model for other communities facing similar challenges. What followed was a community transformation, unlike anything I could have imagined. The city's Department of Environmental Services partnered with us to develop a comprehensive hillside water management plan that went far beyond my original garden. With settlement funds and additional grants secured through environmental initiatives, we began a watershed moment in both literal and figurative senses. Construction equipment that had once been instruments of destruction now carefully reshaped the hillside according to advanced hydrological models. Neighbors who had barely spoken before the disaster now worked side by side on weekends, planting native species according to the expanded design. Even some former HOA board members, humbled by experience, volunteered alongside those whose homes they had inadvertently damaged. The new rain garden system extended across multiple properties, creating a continuous water management zone that protected the entire hillside. Each section was carefully designed for that specific location's soil composition, slope angle, and water volume. Information plaques were installed at key points, explaining how the living infrastructure worked and the environmental benefits it provided. As seasons changed, the newly planted areas began to flourish. First came the early colonizers, tough plants designed to stabilize bare soil. Then followed waves of more diverse species, creating habitats that attracted birds, butterflies, and beneficial insects. During the first significant rainfall after completion, residents gathered outside to watch water flow exactly as designed through the system, slowing at each engineered point, infiltrating through specialized soil mixtures, and emerging clean at designated outlets. The HOA itself underwent complete restructuring with new bylaws that explicitly protected environmental projects and required consultation with relevant experts before removing any established landscaping. A permanent environmental committee was established, which I reluctantly but proudly agreed to chair. 1 year after the settlement, we hosted visitors from neighboring communities facing similar challenges. Standing beside the now thriving Central Rain Garden, I found myself leading an impromptu workshop, explaining various features to homeowners and municipal officials eager to implement similar systems. The most important lesson, I told them as afternoon light filtered through native grasses swaying in the breeze, is that natural systems are not our enemies to be controlled, but our allies to be understood. What looks like wild growth often serves purposes we interrupt at our peril. As the tour concluded, I watched visitors disperse across the neighborhood that now bore official watershed protection zone signs. Where division had once ruled through petty regulations and aesthetic judgments, a shared experience had created something much stronger. We had not merely restored a garden, but had cultivated a community rooted in deeper understanding of our connection to the environment and to each other.